started the animal rights movement in America? Historian Ernest Freeberg will join us to talk about his latest book, A Traitor to His Species. What makes a great picture book? Caldecott honoree Christian Robinson will join us to talk about the art of a picture book. Alexander Alter will have an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's November 6th. I'm Pamela Paul. Ernest Freeberg joins us now. He is the head of the history department at the University of Tennessee, and his most recent book is called A Traitor to His Species, Henry Bergh and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. Ernest, thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. We have to start with the obvious question because this is not a household name for most people. Who was Henry Bergh?
Well, he was the founder of the ASPCA and brought the idea of an animal welfare movement, animal rights laws to the United States right after the Civil War in 1866.
Your area of expertise is 19th and 20th century social and cultural history. It's easy to see why your last book, The Age of Edison, looked at the effects of electricity on society. What got you from there to looking at Henry Bergh and the birth of the animal rights movement?
Well, in all my work, I think I've been interested in the way this time period, what we sort of call the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, into World War I, the way this shaped the modern world, the world that we live in. 2 books ago, I wrote about the origin of civil liberties, civil free speech rights coming out of World War I. The Edison book was looking at our both love and hatred of technology. In this case, I was interested in the way, if you look at an image of a 19th century city, you see horses, and of course there are many, many other animals very closely together with people in the streets. But by the 1920s, that's not the case anymore. In a sense, our urban environment has been stripped of animals. One historian described it as we live in a world where in urban environments, at least, we only have pets and pests. And I thought that captured that pretty well. So I was interested in that transition. And I think the animal welfare movement and Henry Bergh's career in particular kind of captures the beginning of some really profound changes in the relationship between humans and animals that started in that time period. And it is really still with us today.
But to what extent is that change, the decline of animals in urban environments, a consequence of the animal rights movement? To what extent is that really just about technology and industrialization?
Oh, it's certainly all those things. I'm not suggesting that the animal welfare movement itself was a driver in any of this, but rather was a reflection of its sort of changing sensibilities. And in many cases, they welcomed the technological changes. If steam engines and electricity could replace the horse, that was good for the horse as far as the animal welfare movement was concerned. So yes, they're really just part of a much wider change. It's a way to get at people's sensibilities in this time period. This was a time when people came to care much more about animals, but at the same time, the very technology that you're talking about made life pretty grim for many animals as well. The American city was not a friendly place for animals.
Describe what a typical city, and let's just use New York because that is where Bergh lived. What did New York City look like at its peak in terms of the number of animals in the city?
Well, think about horses as the motive power for the entire city. So everything just about relied on horsepower. And that meant enormous traffic jams of carriages and wagons and these horse railroads that were really the first mass transportation in the cities, fundamental to the growth of cities in this time period. But then, of course, there are huge packs of stray dogs roaming in the alleys. This idea of animal control was really developed during this period by the animal welfare movement. Lots of people are moving into the city from rural areas, and they're bringing with them their own traditions of keeping a cow in the backyard and chickens and so forth. Pigs are rooting in the garbage. There really was not very good sanitation control in most neighborhoods. So stray pigs were part of the scene. So it was an enormously rich, complicated, and dirty mix of humans and animals in this time period.
How did Bergh come to care about animal welfare? What was his family and upbringing like, since he didn't come over to this cause until he was in his 50s?
One of his friends later described this as the riddle of the 19th century, that Henry Bergh became the champion of animals that he was, really the most visible animal lover and defender in the United States in this period. He was the son of a wealthy industrialist. He inherited a large fortune. His father was a shipbuilder in Manhattan. Berg wasn't interested in that himself. He tried it for a little while, but then he went to Columbia University, studied law, dropped out, and really wanted to be a playwright, and was apparently a terrible one, but he had enough money to keep at it. He married a wealthy socialite, and they moved to Europe, and they spent most of their time in the capitals of Europe through most of his life, attending the theater, trying to break into the theater, enjoying all the pleasures of sort of being on a grand tour for decades. And it really wasn't until, as you're saying, not until his 50s that he suddenly snapped and decided that he needed to do this with his life. This became his calling.
What was the moment that snapped?
Well, Berg always said during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln appointed him to be part of the embassy in St. Petersburg, Russia. And apparently the Teamsters in St. Petersburg were even more brutal to their horses than the ones in New York. And Berg saw this. He finally snapped at a Teamster. The fact that he was wearing his State Department uniform, gold lace of some kind, apparently intimidated this Teamster who dropped his whip. And Berg said this was the eye-opening moment where he suddenly realized he could make a real difference in life. He went from living an extremely comfortable, opulent life to being in the trenches of New York City in some of the darkest places, dealing with horrendous images of violence and sadism. But he never looked back. He said this was, he was far more satisfied with his life in these terrible situations because he felt like he was doing something important.
What was the basis of his belief in animal welfare? I mean, was this moral? Was it religious? Was it scientific?
Some combination of those. He was not religious in any conventional sense. What he really hated was human cruelty. People considered him to be the great animal lover of the 19th century, but in fact, he didn't really like animals that much. He didn't own pets. He didn't express any real affection for animals, but he hated human cruelty. And he was part of a wider movement of reformers in this period who considered human cruelty, particularly male cruelty, to be a problem that could be solved, not just an inevitable part of life. So there was a sort of, even though he was a sort of Yankee conservative, he had this sort of progressive idea that cruelty could be stamped out if society decided to put some teeth into the law.
Just how cruelly were animals treated at that time? I mean, obviously, they were being slaughtered, they were being worked. Was it gratuitous?
Across the board. Certainly some of it was systemic. Some of it was the fact that horse railroads, for example, to take the most obvious example in the streets of New York, these horse railroads were carrying these trolleys up and down the streets. And the companies that were doing this were trying to maximize the amount of horse energy they could get for the minimum amount of oats and stabling and veterinary care. So they pushed them right to the limit, and they died very, very quickly. This idea of horses being sent out to pasture, that was not the way it worked. They were quickly recycled at the rendering plant after just a few years of being broken. That was a systemic cruelty. There wasn't an intentional sadism there. It was simply good economics to treat animals as interchangeable machines. But of course, Berg saw lots of much more what we would think of as gratuitous violence. He went after dog fighters and pigeon shoots among the elite, cockfighting, children torturing stray animals, that sort of thing. Animal control was another very important area where there was a lot of cruelty, but it was really systemic. I mentioned these large packs of stray dogs in the streets. Cities would wage a war on dogs every summer by offering a bounty on the dogs. And so teenagers and immigrants down in their luck would make a bit of a living by tracking down dogs, either killing them in the streets with a club or else dragging them to the central location where they would be killed. So people were watching this, and a growing number of people decided this didn't have to be.
What kind of animal rights movement, if any, existed before Berg came over to the cause?
There really was none. There had been laws on the books against cruelty, really mostly protecting people's property. You couldn't hurt somebody else's livestock or kick their dog because it was their property. But Berg's law actually invested rights in the animal itself. That didn't matter whether the animal was owned. It had a right not to be treated cruelly. But there really was no movement up until this point. I mean, the sentiment was there. But what Berg managed to do was put in place a very effective law and also to organize a way of organizing sentiment so that those who were supportive of this idea, and there were many, I mean, thousands of people joined the SPCAs, formed SPCAs, modeled on Berg's New York SPCA across the country in order to push the law and to enforce it.
What did the law itself say, and when did it pass?
It passed in 1866. It was a state law, and it chartered the ASPCA, and it also basically said it was illegal to cause unnecessary suffering to essentially all animals. It listed the ones that people thought were most obvious, the livestock and so forth, but then said, and other animals, which really opened up the door for Berg to push this much further than anybody else had expected. The other really crucial part of this law was that it empowered the SPCAs to appoint their own deputies, agents they were called, who wore a badge and who went out in the streets and were themselves empowered to enforce just that law. The assumption here, I think, was that the police either wouldn't bother with this, or else that cruelty itself was kind of hard to define. You know, you're allowed to whip your horse, but there's a certain point at which whipping it is cruelty, and it's unnecessary. You're allowed to slaughter your livestock, but there are ways to do it that cause unnecessary suffering rather than the expected suffering of that process. So the agents were really defining the law by taking these people to court. Berg was one of these agents himself. He was in the streets all the time wearing his top hat and his silver cane, and he never failed to dress like the dandy that he was. But he was right in the streets, grabbing Teamsters off their wagons and throwing them in the gutter and dragging ship owners to court and invading dogfighting rings right to the end.
All right, I want to step back to how he actually gets this law passed, because as you put it, he's this dandy in his 50s. He's a wealthy theater lover who suddenly converts to this cause. How did he actually get this law pushed through in New York? And was there a significant amount of opposition?
It's really interesting. There was very little opposition. When he organizes a meeting in the winter of 1866 and gathers the mayor, the police chief, a lot of distinguished philanthropists, and he issues, something that he would consider to be sort of a Bill of Rights or a Declaration of Independence on behalf of animals. And they all sign on. They're fine with this. I mean, nobody is really in favor of cruelty, except for the cruelty that happens to be convenient for them, right? So people sign on to this law, and they assume that what he's doing is going after people who are beating their horses in the streets. I mean, everybody, I think, recognizes this is a terrible thing. Where Berg started to become controversial, and this became what people called Bergism, was to go after a much wider range of animal problems, like, as I've mentioned, pigeon shooting or the shipping of turtles in cruel ways into the fish markets of New York. People said, that's not what we meant. We thought we were going to protect horses. Sure, we get that. But come on, turtles, who cares? Pigeons, come on. Rats in these rat pits that they would have contests in, who cares about those? And Berg said, look, the law says all animals. And he really forced an incredibly rich conversation that echoes a lot of our own concerns, I think, about animals and where the boundary is between acceptable use and abuse.
And one of the people, probably unexpected, he went after was, of course, P.T. Barnum. What happened between those two?
Well, Barnum was really an incredible entrepreneur in bringing wild animals to the American public. We sort of take the accessibility of wild animals for granted these days with zoos and nature documentaries. But Barnum turned his American Museum in New York City into an incredible vehicle for people to come and watch. He had the first manatee in captivity, and he cut a hole in one of his floors so that he could have a giraffe that was straddling the upper floor and the lower floor. Huge collections of animals. He had an exhibit he called The Happy Family, where he put in predators and prey together and tried to convince people that this was a tableau of natural harmony. So this was obviously a place where there was a lot of abuse of animals, at least to Berg's sensibility. People loved it. Barnum made himself a millionaire for selling tickets to these sorts of events. But Berg went after him, especially because Barnum's museum burned down several times with a tremendous loss of all these animals. For Barnum, it was a financial loss, but he could always go buy some more on the international wild animal market. But for Berg, this was evidence that this should not be happening. And he was actually way ahead of his time in essentially saying we should not be having elephants on display for our entertainment. Inevitably, this produces abuse, and better not to see an elephant than to see it under these circumstances, and they should be sent back to wherever they came from or else humanely killed.
P.T. Barnum was obviously a kind of formidable opponent, but he ended up coming to Berg's funeral. It's kind of surprising.
Barnum always said he was an animal lover, too. He didn't buy Berg's argument that he was being cruel to animals. He said, and actually quite correctly, he said, I know a lot more about animals than Berg does. And he would not have been able to succeed in his profession without learning how to care for these animals. So he had his own way. He actually loved when Berg went after him because, as you may know, Barnum was perfect at turning any controversy into ticket sales. So he did that very effectively. Whenever Berg challenged him, it ramped up into debates in the newspaper, and more people showed up to see what was going on. But Barnum always said, I'm the Berg of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And, I care just as much about these things. And I think they came to a kind of admiration over the years, although Barnum always felt like Berg was a bit over the edge, eccentric in his passions and misguided in some ways. He still admired what Berg was doing and actually donated some money in his own will to create a little memorial to Berg in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Many of the leaders of the progressive movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century in its various forms look through the lens of 2020 now not to have been necessarily as progressive or as liberal as one might be today. Obviously, it's difficult to impose values of today back on that era. But do Berg's ideas around animals hold up and fit in with the ideas around animal rights and animal welfare today?
I think they do. One thing that he missed, or I think he was aware of missing, was the sort of wider environmental problems. I mean, I sort of get at this with the discussion about turtles, where he's very worried about the treatment of the green turtles that are being shipped into New York, and they're put in front of a saloon upside down with a sign on them saying soup on Friday, the sort of gross treatment of these beautiful animals, while being completely unaware of the fact that these animals were being eaten to extinction far away in Key West and in the Caribbean. The animal welfare was very focused on the animals right in front of you, rather than thinking about the systemic abuse of animals. I think the environmental movement is much more attuned to now. He also was not what we would think of in the modern parlance as a liberationist. He was not a vegetarian. He said society should have stayed vegetarian, but it's too late now. So he was basically saying we have a right to use animals in traditional ways. We just don't have a right to abuse them, and we don't have a right to take pleasure in their suffering.
Did your own ideas around animals and animal rights change in the course of researching and writing this book?
Well, I think it got me to notice this period as a really interesting one, and the way we think about animals today. I think about how rare it is to see an animal that's not on a leash in an urban environment, except for the few that human beings have been unable to wrangle and capture, like rats and pigeons. So that idea that we live in a world that is in a sense, identifies animals as being inappropriate in an urban environment, except if they're carefully licensed and leashed. I see that much more than I did by spending all these years thinking about what the city looked like in the late 19th century.
What's your next book going to be about?
Oh, that's really complicated. I want to write about the history of retirement in America. So it's quite a different direction. I've been thinking about the way that we tell ourselves that there is this period of life between work and old age where we have an opportunity to recreate ourselves. And in fact, we're supposed to spend all of our working days saving up money in order to have this last experience. And so the things we choose to do with that time period in our lives, or at least we're told we should do, I think tells us a lot about our values right now. So that's my next project. It's just getting started.
All right. Well, another book to look forward to. In the meantime, we have A Traitor to His Species, Henry Berg, and the Birth of the Animal Rights Movement. Ernest, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was fun.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Christian Robinson joins us now from Sacramento. He is a picture book illustrator and author whose latest book is called You Matter, which he wrote and illustrated. He has also written another, which he illustrated himself, and he's illustrated books by authors such as Julie Fogliano, Matt de la Pena, with whom he won a Newbery Medal for the book Last Stop on Market Street. He's illustrated books by Matt Barnett, Justin Roberts, Linda Ashman, Kelly DiPuccio, and Renee Watson. Christian, thanks for being here.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I actually first encountered your work with your first book, which was written by Renee Watson. The book was called Harlem's Little Blackbird, the story of Florence Mills. And I was the children's book editor at the times when that book came out. And I remember I was just so struck by it. I thought, here is something really distinctive, really different, really beautiful. Can you talk about that first book and how you got started as a children's book illustrator?
I've been drawing and making pictures my whole life. And I went to college for animation. So kind of in the same realm, storytelling and visual storytelling. But sort of what happened was I kind of graduated college. I interned at Pixar Animation Studios. I worked with Sesame Street Workshop doing like educational animated short films for them. But I always kind of kept an online journal, a blog, of just kind of visual projects that I was just working on for myself for fun. And I'd always loved illustration and picture books, but had no idea how to break into that world. And one day I just get an email from a person being like, if you don't have an agent already, consider me a fan. And that ended up being Stephen Malk, who is one of the best people you could have representing you.
He's the guy.
Yes, he's also just an amazing human being and a good friend. And I lucked out.
Let's talk about that first project because Renee Watson, of course, has gone on to write a number of novels which have sold incredibly well. I think they're bestsellers, critically acclaimed. How did that project come about?
It was one of the first manuscripts that ever came to me, and it was all new to me. So I was just excited, and I read it, and I loved it. I had never heard of Florence Mills, and her story was empowering to me. And I don't know, I was just really excited to work on it. I knew from the get-go I wanted the book to have a certain tone. I wanted it to be bright and joyful and focus on how powerful this woman was.
So let's talk about what you see when you are looking at the text for a book. Does it tell you, hey, on this page, you should draw this, and now this is where you turn the page? What are you actually looking at when you decide, that you're basing your illustrations off of?
Sometimes the author might break down where they would like a page break, but sometimes it's very open, and sometimes it's almost like reading a poem, and the author is very open to where those breaks could be, which I appreciate because, as a visual person, I'm thinking about how I want to set it up and what kind of story I can add that complements their writing. I think I'm just sort of looking for those moments that I think are impactful, that are fun to illustrate, that I visualize. Oftentimes I think when I'm reading a manuscript, that's what I'm doing. I'm just like, what images are popping into my head and what would I have the most fun illustrating?
So here's another thing, another misconception that listeners may have. I certainly did before I, remotely worked in this world, which is like, oh, picture books, easy to read, easy to write and illustrate, easy things. It's not easy. What are the challenges of illustrating a picture book?
To this day, I don't know how long I've been doing it, 10 years or so. Each time I sit down to illustrate a page or just plan something out, it's work. It's like a mountain that I have to kind of climb and figure things out. But we're given a limited amount of space, a limited amount of words, limited pages. So it's really about finding a way to communicate an idea simply, making sure it connects with young readers, making it sure it connects with the adults, the parents, maybe even connecting with, of course, teachers and librarians, the people who are going to be using these tools, these books. So it's just all these things you want to keep in mind. At the same time, you want to make sure it's something maybe that's familiar to people so that they, connect with it, but also you want it to be something new. But also you have to appeal to the publisher because it needs to be something that is marketable and sellable. So but you also want to, you're an artist. So you want to make sure that it's, speaking to something, close to you and that means something to you. So it's all these things that you just kind of have to balance out.
What makes you say yes to a project? Because I imagine that at this point, I mean, your books have sold very well. They're critically acclaimed. You've won the Best Illustrated Award for the New York Times at least once. What makes you say yes to a project?
Again, it's that while reading it, what pictures emerge in my head, and can I see myself just having fun with illustrating it? That's kind of really important to me is, you know, these things take time. They take me about, 4 to 5 months to illustrate a whole book. It's a commitment. And I want to make sure that I'm choosing a project that I, can just enjoy the time that I'm working on it, enjoying the process. I think I'm looking for something that I feel sometimes is missing. Like there are a lot of books out in the world, and I want to put something out in the world that I feel might be needed, that I need to see in the world. Sometimes I'm almost like having a conversation with my inner child. What is the book that I would have loved to have seen on a bookshelf?
Was that part of the impetus of writing books on your own?
Absolutely. Well, first off, let me say I love just creating books, period. Illustrating, writing. I'd illustrated several books by other authors before taking a stab at writing. And that's because I respect the authors of picture books. It is hard work, it is a skill. And I felt like I was kind of in school learning from each author that I've worked with. Writing was kind of just another way to express myself, but it's another opportunity to kind of put those books out in the world that I want to see.
So let's talk about Another. That was the first book that you wrote and illustrated, correct?
Yes. Although there's no words.
Did that make it easier?
I guess I still get the title of author, which is great, even though it's wordless. But yeah, that means just more planning. So it is more work, authoring and illustrating, but it's also more rewarding, right?
If the goal is to put something out there that was missing, that you would have wanted as a child, that you want to see out there in the world as an author and illustrator, what was it that you wanted to add with that book, that first wordless book, Another?
Well, for a while, I've been thinking about what matters to me in picture books. What is it that I want to see? And I kept thinking about the importance of children seeing themselves in the books they read. As someone who works with images, as an illustrator, I know how powerful pictures can be, how powerful it is to see a reflection of yourself, how that sends a message that, you're seen, you're valuable, you matter. And I think what was missing that I wasn't seeing was sort of like a story about a person of color, a child, a Black girl, kind of going on this magical adventure where anything is possible. I think that's an important image to see. Like, I feel like oftentimes growing up, I saw so many movies and read so many books about kids that didn't necessarily look like me or come from my community, going on these magical adventures or discovering some power that they had. And that sends a message too. So I wanted to create a story where all kinds of kids could see themselves going on this magical adventure.
So, okay, here's a challenge because this is a wordless book told through pictures, but we are in a medium that is only words. What's the story of Another?
I think another thing that's important for me that I wanted to see in a book is a book that leaves space and room for the reader, the observer to kind of make their own interpretation. For me, I will say it's kind of about what would happen if you met yourself. Would you get along with that person you met? Would you be kind to yourself? Would you be unkind? Would you fight?
Those are deep questions. And again, some people who may think that picture books are simple or easy might be surprised to think that such deep, profound questions are part of a picture book. I mean, what do you think a picture book can do ideally or should do or is capable of doing?
A picture book is capable of doing infinite amounts of things. I think for me, it's important to create picture books that connect with people. I can only bring so much to that story, to those words, to that picture, but I know that so much of that story is written by how the person reading it experiences it. And I love that collaboration. I love that connection. Stories that connect us, stories that reflect our experiences.
So your next book that you worked on your own, You Matter, your latest book, came out this year, a little bit earlier. This book actually does have words. Did you think to yourself, like, okay, I've done my wordless book. Now I'm actually going to go a step further? Or how did that come about?
I didn't set out to make a wordless book. I had this kind of story appear in my head of, oh, this girl will be sleeping in bed with her cat, and all of a sudden this like hole will appear in the wall, and another cat that looks identical to her cat will appear. And so I kind of sketched all these things out, and then I thought, oh, I'll go back and write the story later. And then I thought, wait a minute. If I'm telling the story and there's no words here, then maybe I don't need words. So that's kind of how that happened. But with You Matter, the words and the pictures kind of emerged at the same time. Again, I asked myself, what is it that I'm not seeing in the world? What is it that I most want to put out in the world? And it was simple. The most important thing I feel like I can say to a young reader or to anyone who picks up this book is, you matter.
Let's talk about Last Stop on Market Street, which won a Newbery Medal for the author, Matt de la Pena. And you, of course, did the illustrations, and it sort of stemmed from an idea of yours. So was this one of those collaborative projects? How did it come about?
This book was really unique in that, again, oftentimes I don't even talk with the author or meet them. But in this case, the seed of the story came from a picture that I illustrated. So yeah, my agent who found me through my blog online saw a picture of a painting that I did of me and my grandmother riding the bus in the city, which we did often growing up in LA because my grandmother didn't drive. And he saw this painting and he said, I think there's a story here. Do you mind if I pass this along to an author that I represent, Matt de la Pena? And Matt saw it and thought there was a story. And a few weeks later, there's this manuscript, Last Stop on Market Street.
So you use the word fun a lot. It's a word I really like. It's the name of your website, The Art of Fun. Why fun?
I do use the word fun a lot. Well, first off, it was a domain name that was free, which was amazing. No, but also I think of the art of, which means the mastery of a skill, the art of cooking, the art of archery, whatever. And I love the idea of mastering fun, mastering enjoying the process. If I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, how can I expect someone else to? And that is another intention of mine, is to at least put a smile on, whoever's looking at what I'm doing, because I'm smiling for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Not always.
I urge people to go to your Instagram too, where there is so much joy in there. And you think, especially in this difficult time, but you're on there, you're dancing, there's so much positivity. And given that we are kind of living in a tough time, I'm curious sort of where that comes from. Is that just natural expression of how you're feeling? Is that to counterbalance some of the darkness out there in the world? What's that about?
I think I am trying to balance something out, not just out in the world, but within myself. For me, creativity and expressing myself, this is all me just trying to process and make sense of the world. It's me working through things. The title, You Matter, that's something that I have to remind myself. And it takes courage to see your own value and to believe in yourself. And again, that's why it's important for me to put these things out in the world. I wanted to let young people know that they matter, not because of how smart they are or how many good grades they get or trophies they've won or accomplishments. You matter simply just because you're here. I try to make that a practice for myself, just enjoying being here and not being toxically positive about everything or ignoring all the pain and suffering, but just sort of appreciating what is in front of you that you can appreciate.
Well, let's all think on that for a while. That's a very good place to end. Christian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Christian Robinson is the author and illustrator of You Matter and Another, and the illustrator of many, many picture books, including some of my favorites, Leo, A Ghost Story, Last Stop on Market Street, and Harlem's Little Blackbird, among many others. Also, I just have to say, he is one of my favorites. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela.
What's going on this week?
So to my total shock, it is November, and I don't know how that happened, but it's a really interesting and critical period for publishers and for booksellers. It's, we're entering really intense holiday shopping. And of course, we've never had a year like this one with a pandemic really raging across the country, the potential for new shutdowns of bookstores and things like that. and real strain on the supply chain. So it's a really challenging environment for both publishers and even more so, I think, for booksellers this year. It's a very interesting dynamic, though, because we've still seen really strong book sales. So publishers are actually, I think they've been able to exhale a little bit. They were holding their breath in the spring and in the early parts of the summer. But as they're kind of rounding the corner at the end of the year, we're seeing reports that print sales are up, digital sales are way up, particularly ebooks and digital audio. And the latest figures from the Association of American Publishers showed that for the first 3 quarters of the year, trade sales were up by about 8.5% over 2019, which is really astonishing given all the challenges in the retail environment and the supply chain challenges and the fact that so many pub dates were moved, that book tours and author events were canceled. Everything that publishers have always relied on to get their books in front of readers and book buyers was challenged this year, and yet people are reading and buying books. So that's the good news. What's the opposite of a silver lining? The gray cloud that's accompanying this silver lining is that bookstores are really struggling. So a lot of those book sales, as we've talked about before, have shifted to online. They've shifted to big box stores. And independents are finding it really hard to make ends meet. And there's a recent report from the American Booksellers Association that they're concerned that 20% of independent bookstores across the country are in danger of closing. So a lot of booksellers are putting out pleas to their communities, to their customer base to say, like, shop early this year. Please buy from independents and send in your orders early because they're expecting, it's going to take a while to get all the shipments processed and things. A lot of them are spending more than they've ever had to on things like postage and mailing things. And of course, our postal service has been under enormous strain from the pandemic. So there's all these additional challenges and costs that they're facing. So that's the grimmer news that we're looking at. And then I think a lot of people are looking at what's happening in Europe right now, where there's a really severe outbreak of coronavirus. And some countries, France, Germany, England, are looking at new lockdowns where bookstores are going to be closed again. So this is not good timing in terms of holiday sales. People here are thinking, wow, if we face something like that, that could be tough.
I've been watching on Instagram as all of the independent UK bookstores that I follow have been posting their, last day of shopping, come now messages and urging people to continue to buy online from them.
Yeah, and I do think shoppers are responding to that. From the reports I've read, there's been a real shopping rush ahead of the new lockdown. So in England, in the UK, a lot of people are rushing to bookstores to stock up, and publishers have actually moved some of their publication dates or their on-sale dates up to give bookstores another boost, to give them some new merchandise that was maybe, not going to be out until later this month. And they've made those books available for sale early to just sort of give booksellers a little bit of an edge and to give themselves an opportunity to sell those titles before another lockdown.
I hope those stores get to open before the holiday season is over. I feel like London bookshops are so jolly during the holidays. Maybe that's my bias, but they seem jollier there than elsewhere.
I think they're extremely jolly. Yeah. And I know that they, as bookstores here, have been really disproportionately affected by the shutdown and the impact on sales. So yes, I agree with you. It would be very nice if they could open up again before the holidays.
Especially because there's so many good books to look forward to this month.
Yes, it's kind of an astonishingly fertile period for publishing, which it usually isn't around this time of year. I think things kind of taper off because everyone wants to get their books out before the holidays. But yes, as you said, there's a ton of really exciting stuff coming out in November. There's Barack Obama's memoir. There's a new novel by Jonathan Lethem. There's a Nicole Krauss collection of stories. So there's really exciting fiction, nonfiction, thrillers. Yo Nesbo's thriller, The Kingdom, is coming out. That was one of those spring titles that got bumped back quite a bit. So we're seeing a lot of books that people are going to want to buy, and hopefully, they'll buy them from bookstores.
All right, then. Let's hope so. Alexandra, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Emily Aiken and Jumana Khatib. Hey, guys.
Hey,
Hi.
Pamela.
Emily, let's start with you. What are you reading right now?
I'm reading a really interesting book. The book is Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. It was published earlier this year at the beginning of the pandemic in our country. And it's a pretty remarkable book by a very remarkable young writer. There have been a spate of books in the last few years about immigration and asylum seekers, many of them by well-meaning liberal journalists concerned about the tightening of immigration policy in this country and the treatment of immigrants at our border. And we've seen books by immigrants like Leila Lalami. I was thinking about her book. She just published a book, Conditional Citizen. She's a Moroccan-born novelist who became a naturalized citizen and wrote about the second-class treatment she's received as an Arab, a Muslim, and a woman in this country. But there have been really very few books that I'm aware of by undocumented Americans. The only other one I can think of is Dear America by Jose Antonio Vargas. And when he decided to write about being undocumented, his lawyers said this was a suicide mission. And now we have Undocumented Americans by another undocumented American. Her book stands out not just for its subject matter, but for its sheer writerly cred. I was just very taken with this book. It's very personal. It's a combination of memoir and reportage, but it's also very beautifully written. And it begins in a moment of disgust and anger and defiance the day after the 2016 presidential election. Carla is in her late 20s. She's a graduate student in American Studies at Yale. And she says right away that she's gone to graduate school for the health insurance, forcing you to think right there about the complications of being an undocumented person, a young person in this country. The day after the election, she emails a literary agent that she knows, and she says she's ready to write a book about undocumented Americans. And let me tell you, this is not a book about the joys and dreams of assimilation. This is a book that is pissed off. And at the same time, it's full of a kind of fierce love for other undocumented people in this country. And her goal is really to paint a portrait of undocumented Americans in all their complications, to kind of transcend those shadowy cardboard cutouts that we read about in the media, where they're kind of routinely depicted as these mute, tragic figures, in her view. She hates the way the media refers to undocumented people as undocumented workers, as if all they're good for is labor. I wanted to read you a passage, actually, because that captures, I think, both her skill and her sort of bravura. She writes, "I've heard them call us undocumented workers as a euphemism, as if there was something uncouth about being just an undocumented person standing with your hands clasped together at your sides. I almost wish they'd call us something rude like crazy expletive Mexicans, because that's acknowledging something about us beyond our usefulness. We're crazy, we're Mexican, we're clearly unwanted. But to describe all of us, men, women, children, locally Instagram famous teens, queer puppeteers, all of us as workers in order to make us palatable, my God, we were brown bodies made to labor, faces pixelated."
She's not Mexican, right? She's from Ecuador.
She's from Ecuador, and some of the most moving passages in the book are about her family. She's deeply connected to her parents, who are undocumented immigrants. Her father drove a cab in New York City until legislation was passed prohibiting undocumented people from having driver's licenses, at which point he became a restaurant delivery man, or boy, as she reminds us, we patronizingly refer to such people. Her family lived on his tips. It's an extraordinary window into lives we don't get to read about. She also introduces us to day laborers in Staten Island. This is a very moving section. You meet men who live in kind of crushing isolation and loneliness by themselves, typically with families back in their home countries to whom they're sending remittances. She takes us to suburban families who are living with one parent missing because the parent has been deported, to a couple of churches in New Haven where she's befriended men who are undocumented, who have sought sanctuary and are living in a church in order to avoid being deported. She takes us to a voodoo ceremony in Miami and to an underground pharmacy where undocumented people can buy drugs without medical supervision, which terrifies her. It's really an extraordinary book.
And does she focus mostly on Latin American undocumented immigrants?
Most of the people that she encounters are Spanish speakers as a first language. So they typically are from Mexico, Latin America, South America. She herself, of course, is Ecuadorian American. And I think a couple of the people she meets in Miami are of Haitian origin.
Got it.
Well, Emily, I think I'm taking the opposite tactic that you are with your reading. You're reading something that is very of the moment and very timely. And I am retreating back into the 1400s, which is unusual for me. I don't tend to read a lot of historical fiction, but I am reading Leo Africanus by Amin Malouf, who's a Lebanese writer who writes mostly in French. And I think this is the first book of his to be published in English. It was written in the 80s. And basically it follows this sort of Andalusian Arab, I think he's a Berber explorer, and follows him from Granada to Fez and Cairo and Rome. And it's this real, almost kind of picaresque story. And it's very evocative. You can feel like you're walking around those cities at the time of the Moors. And it's been wonderful escapist reading for me. But Pamela, tell us what you're reading.
I read two books I want to talk about. One was recommended by our colleague Elizabeth Egan, and it's a novel by Amity Gage called Sea Wife. This is a book told from two perspectives. A married couple, Juliet, who is speaking to us in the present, and then her husband, Michael, whose entries are done as a captain's log. And it's about the two of them kind of escaping with their two children, who are 7 and 2, to sail for a year or possibly longer, which is, I think, a fantasy that even those of us who really don't like sailing at all nonetheless have. This just idea that you could escape everything, escape work, escape politics, escape consumer culture, escape, other people, and just be on the open sea. And then, of course, we all know that in practice, for most people, it's not that easy. And that's the case in this book, which I think is based on a real life story. So there's a thriller aspect to this, but you get the sense that Amity Gage's aims are not primarily to thrill you, but to explore a marriage and to explore a marriage at this moment. So the divisions that exist between the husband and wife are not just personal, but also political and also very much sort of based in current gender dynamics. It's an interesting book. It definitely kept me moving along. It's the first book that I've ever read by Amity Gage, who I think is best known for a previous novel called Schroeder. Have either of you read her before?
I have not,
I
but I've heard only wonderful things about her, actually.
Well, and I loved the conceit of Sea Wife. It just seems like the perfect kind of vehicle for a novel. Throw a family on a boat and see what happens. Kind of amazing.
And then there's throw a family off a boat, see what happens.
Yeah. Sounds like there's a lot of baggage on that boat. Yeah.
So, and the other book I read in an afternoon because a friend of mine wanted to borrow it. And it's a book I've been meaning to read for a long time because I'm a huge fan of the author, Liana Finck. And that book is called Passing for Human.
Oh.
Do you love Liana Finck?
She's
yes,
amazing.
love her.
Do we all love Liana Finck?
We all love Liana Finck.
I was introduced to her at a publishing party back when there were publishing parties at Book Expo. And I remember the person who introduced her to me said, she is a genius. And actually, of course you think, well, everyone's being introduced to you as a genius at these kinds of things, but she is a genius. She is a complete and total genius. And I think I've talked about her on the podcast before. But this memoir, I think, is really something special. Have either of you read this?
No.
Is it illustrated? I mean, I'm guessing it's illustrated, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. It's a graphic memoir, and it really bends the rules of memoir pretty brilliantly in a number of ways. So one of the things that it does is it starts over and over the way that you might do if you're telling your life story and kind of revising it and saying, well, no, actually, this is the beginning, or this is the way it goes, or no, let me tell this right. So she keeps beginning it again and again. And she also manipulates the characters of her own life to suit her narrative ends. There's this great part in which she basically draws the character of her father as being this kind of person who has suffered all his life from various anxieties and fears. And then at a certain point, he sort of turns around and is like, yeah, but this isn't the way it was. And she's like, well, no, but that's the way it needs to be for this particular, for my purpose here. So you're left not really knowing entirely what is real and what is fiction, but like everything she does, she's an incredible mind. Both her art and her text will just sort of keep you pondering. And I would refer to more specific things in it, except that I actually don't have it, having given it away to the person who wanted to borrow it from me. But I highly recommend. All right, let's run down the titles of what we read this week. Emily, we'll start with you.
Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio.
And Jumana?
I'm reading Leo Africanus by Amin Malouf.
And I read Sea Wife by Amity Gage and Passing for Human by Liana Fink. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.